Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's web conference on UNESCO World Heritage Interpretation, which has been jointly organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea and the Korean National Commission for UNESCO. By the way, my name is Jin Sung-jeon, the Director of Culture Division at the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, and it is my great pleasure to be your MC for today's event. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to review a few technical details. Today's conference is divided into two parts. The first part consists of 4 presentations, which will be immediately followed by a panel discussion in part 2. With your kind understanding, we would like to proceed the entire program for today without a break between the two parts. And if you have any questions during the presentation or the following discussions, please send them to us through the chat box. We will get back to them as long as the time allows. Lastly, English-Korean simultaneous interpretation will be provided for today's event. Therefore, please make sure that you have a correct language setting on your screen. Today, we will be discussing the way forward for heritage interpretation, including discussions of the role of heritage interpretation, an applicable set of principles for it, and enablers of equitable heritage interpretations. Before getting into the presentations, I would like to first invite Mr. Jong-ho Kyun, Director General for Public Diplomacy and Cultural Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea, to give us his opening remarks.
Distinguished guests, it is my great pleasure to announce the opening of 2021 International Conference on UNESCO World Heritage Interpretation. I would like to extend my gratitude to all the participants for joining us today. This year marks the 75th anniversary of UNESCO. Over the years, we have seen a myriad of remarkable achievements, especially in our work to preserve invaluable heritages around the world. Today, 1,154 heritages are on the World Heritage List. The importance lies not only on the increased number of World Heritage sites, but also on the advanced perception and meaning of World Heritage. The definition of heritage has broadened, shifting its exclusive focus on materials form onto deeper analysis of social role it can play. The evolving and expanding concept of heritage highlights that heritage sites can have differing and even conflicting meanings for different communities. Furthermore, depending on the perspectives, a single heritage site may represent both positive and negative aspects of human history. Only when such multiple narratives embedded in heritage are fully represented, we can finally accomplish our duty to pass on the full history of the site to future generations. This is why a comprehensive and inclusive interpretation is crucial. And to this end, we need to set principles for heritage interpretation that will ensure a full representation of diverse stories and surrounding heritage. In this connection, the Republic of Korea has annually hosted the Conference on UNESCO World Heritage Interpretation since 2016. Following last year's conference on the rights-based approaches in heritage interpretation, this year we will focus on the principles and the ways forward for heritage interpretation. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that today's conference will provide us with a valuable opportunity to reaffirm once again the importance of inclusive interpretation and to collect our wisdom to find the principles and ways forward for inclusive heritage interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gyun, for your kind word. Now, I'm very pleased to invite Dr. Kyung-Gu Han, Secretary General of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, to give us some welcoming remarks.
Good morning and good evening to all our guests and speakers, wherever you are. I'm Kyung-Gu Han, Secretary General of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the conference and to be connected with you across the globe. Interpretation is involved at all stages of the implementation of the World Heritage Convention. The initial identification of an element to be investigated for its heritage value is already an act of interpretation, and interpretation underlies all decisions that particular elements are significant for the present and should be protected for the future. This conference on World Heritage Interpretation has been annually organized since 2016 with the participation of internationally renowned experts in the field. It has been our unwavering aim to contribute to raising awareness about the importance of heritage interpretation and establishing a meaningful discourse on the subject. In order to incorporate this important discussion of interpretation with the mechanisms of a World Heritage Convention, we also started a research project this year to outline a set of principles upon which the interpretation of cultural heritage places should be based in order to avoid conflict between and within state parties when the outstanding universal value of places is identified for nomination, inscription, and management purposes. Today's conference, with its theme of World Heritage Interpretation, Principles and Way Forward, is based on the efforts and insights of the members of the working group for this research. We are gathered today to discover where the speakers and discussants may take us from here. We also wish to make an emphatic statement once again of the importance of interpretation and the need for a set of principles to guide interpretation, as well as offering some illustrative cases that exemplify the need and the relevance of the principles. I hope this conference will give us a valuable opportunity to foster discussions about what the principles underlying heritage interpretation should be and how we can apply the principles to the system of the World Heritage Convention, which can lead to a set of principles that we all agree upon. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Han, for your encouraging words. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first presenter, Mr. Alessandro Balsamo. Mr. Balsamo is currently working as head of the nomination unit at the UNESCO World Heritage Center. Today, he will brief us on heritage interpretation within the context of the World Heritage Convention. Mr. Balsamo, thank you for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, and good evening, good afternoon to everyone. At the outset of my intervention, let me please thank His Excellency Mr. Dong-Ji Kim, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary, Permanent Delegate of the Republic of Korea to UNESCO, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Korea, and the Korean National Commission for UNESCO for organizing this meeting. The topic of interpretation of cultural and or natural sites is a quite complex subject in itself to discuss, but the discussion may be even more complex when talking about interpretation within the context of the World Heritage Convention, which is based on the notion of outstanding universal value. The overarching presence of this notion throughout the World Heritage System and its own peculiarity is something that we cannot ignore and that we have to constantly keep in mind when talking about interpretation of cultural and or natural sites in this particular context. Talking about interpretation, it implies talking about sites of memory and about criterion 6. Basically, we can affirm that all cultural and or natural sites have the potential to be sites of memory in varying degrees and thus lend themselves to different interpretations. In some cultures, memories transmitted in intangible forms bear more significant value than physical evidence of the sites. Until relatively recently, the dynamic and plural nature of the world's cultural and natural heritage in diverse societies has not been suitably considered in the works and systems of the World Heritage Convention. The study of sites of memory began with Pierre Nora in an article entitled Mémoire collective, Collective Memory, published in the early 70s, in which he postulates the need for research into sites of memory. In that article, Nora did not define the term, but he did in its 1996 work titled Les lieux de mémoire, the sites of memory. And according to Nora, a lieu de mémoire is any significant entity, whether material or non-material in nature, which by dint of human will or the work of time has become a symbolic element of the memorial heritage of any community. Sites of memory, in his view, could include places such as museums, cathedrals, mosques, temples, palaces, cemeteries, archives, and memorials. Concept and practice such as commemorations, mottos, and all rituals. But also objects such as inherent property, commemorative monuments, manuals, emblems, basic text, and symbols. Values and meanings of heritage sites can be developed by different groups. We have to therefore acknowledge the fact that a collective memory of heritage places is not always consistent. History teaches that each and every heritage site is composed of diverse, plural, and often dissonant memories and associations. When similar values and significance are shared in different sites, this underpins common human accomplishments, which may become an opportunity for further cooperation. When approached positively with a real desire to appease, diverse interpretation or memories of heritage sites can set the ground to bridge divides and deepen social cohesion. The questions which arise are, how can the World Heritage Convention approach the representation of these sites of memory? Or should, or rather, could the World Heritage Convention, in its notion of outstanding universal value, address these issues? Nowadays, this is a very important topic in our societies, and there is growing interest around it, and as it is the case in the context of the 1972 Convention. In this regard, I wish to recall that the World Heritage Committee at its 42nd session in 2018 decided to launch a comprehensive reflection on sites associated with memories of recent conflicts in view of the increasing number of nominations submitted or under preparation related to this category of sites. This reflection was relaunched by the committee at its last session after the release of some reports and studies. And an open-ended working group has been established to work intersessionally and report to the next session of the committee in Kazan next June 2022, which will examine its outcome. The objective of the World Heritage Convention is to identify, protect, conserve, and present World Heritage properties and transmit them to future generations. To be listed as a World Heritage property, a site must reach the threshold of outstanding universal value. The determination of whether or not a property has OUV is decided by the World Heritage Committee using such criteria as it shall establish. And among the 10 criteria for inscription on the World Heritage List, criterion 6 is the one that more than others links the intangible aspects to the realm of the tangible as defined by the 1972 Convention. Criterion 6 is special because it operates differently from the other 9 inscription criteria. While from a present day perspective, all criteria for assessing OUV are considered to have an associative dimension, criterion 6 explicitly recognizes that the outstanding universal significance of the associative dimension of World Heritage sites such as events, living traditions, ideas, beliefs, artistic works, and literary works. In other words, unlike the other 9 criteria, which assess the significance of the site itself, criterion 6 first assesses the significance of the associations, followed by a second assessment of the nature of the link between such associations and the site, and by a third assessment based on a comparison with other similar associations and their links to sites. Due to its special character, criterion 6 has often been the subject of expert meetings. And we must note that from the very beginning, criterion 6 presented a challenge to the World Heritage System. In 1979, following an analysis of the first 2 years of the nomination, the World Heritage Committee expressed concern about potential inflation of the World Heritage List and narrow focus on national interest and the political issues. It therefore directed that particular attention should be given to cases which fall under criterion 6, so that the net result will not be a reduction in the value of the list due to the large potential number of nominations, as well as to political difficulties. Nomination concerning, in particular, historical events or famous people could be strongly influenced by nationalism or other particularism in contradiction with the objectives of the World Heritage Convention. The following year, the committee modified its operational guidelines to require a restrictive approach to the application of criterion 6. And the conceptual shift visible in the early 90s in UNESCO intangible heritage discourse also found expression in the context of World Heritage. It affected the interpretation of all concepts. Through the cultural landscape category and the global strategy, an anthropological approach to cultural heritage was introduced by recognizing the present-day relationship between human beings and their environment with it. Intangible heritage in terms of cultural association, such as, most importantly, associated living traditions. Criteria were revised accordingly, and an associated intangible dimensions not only considered through the broadening of criterion 6, but the tangible, intangible continuum also addressed the wording of other criteria. With the focus on the anthropological, that is, human component, the local perspective found its way into the concept of outstanding universal value. The recognition of local cultural association of OUV was first implemented with the inscription of Tongariro National Park in 1993, initially listed as a natural site. In the context of rethinking the definition of authenticity, various intangible elements were acknowledged to be carriers of truthfulness, such as the construction techniques and the spirit of place. Thus, credit was given to different approaches to authenticity. It is also in the conceptual debate on authenticity that the term intangible was introduced into World Heritage. In total, over the years, the wording of criterion 6 underwent several changes and 7 different versions, trying to adapt it to the specific context of the World Heritage Convention. The convention focuses on properties and aims primarily to identify and protect the material evidence of physical places having OUV. The 1994 NARA document on authenticity introduced the idea of information sources. Intangible heritage was conceived as an information source for cultural heritage that carries the truthfulness of a place. As guidance for authenticity judgments, the NARA document expanded the list of information sources to include several aspects of intangible heritage, such as use, function, traditions, techniques, spirits, and feelings. For the interpretation of a site of memory in the context of a World Heritage Convention to be effective, first and foremost, the memorial associated values must be identified and spelled out as part of its statement of its outstanding universal value, which ideally should involve the relevant stakeholders. This is an essential first stage in the definition and interpretation of any heritage site. The way in which recognition of the memorial aspect is expressed affects the way in which the site is defined and interpreted. While it may be possible in some cases to carry interpretation beyond the bounds of the values identified by official statement, there is likely to be a tendency not to focus on wider values. Interpretation of these associated values could then be proposed in the management plan. Another aspect of capital importance is to acknowledge the fact that absolute truth does not exist. Any narrative for a site is an interpretation of the known evidence for it. Sites of memory are generally associated with intangible values, also known as associated values. It derives from people's feelings about, understanding of, and relationship to a place, its history, and the uses to which it has been customarily applied. Hence, the inclusive principle that endorses the role of the people, particularly the local communities, through the concept of public participation, forms an integral part of such interpretation. The interpretation of sites of memory requires the principle of inclusiveness, and all the insights associated with a particular place be addressed. The memorial aspects that acquire from the appreciation of their associated values could justify their recognition as sites of memory. However, the interpretation of these associated values demands a prudent approach through dialogue in developing description for a place with memorial aspects. The ICOMOS Charter for the Interpretation and Presentation of Cultural Heritage defines interpretation as the full range of potential activities intended to heighten public awareness and enhance understanding of the complexities of cultural heritage sites. Presentations more specifically denote the carefully planned communication of interpretive content through the arrangement of interpretive information and interpretive infrastructure at the cultural heritage site. The ICOMOS Charter set out 7 principal objectives for interpretation. 1. Facilitate understanding and appreciation of cultural heritage sites and foster public awareness and engagement in the need for their protection and conservation. 2. Communicate the meaning of cultural heritage sites to a range of audiences through careful documented recognition of significance, through accented scientific and scholarly methods, as well as from living cultural traditions. 3. Safeguarded tangible and intangible values of cultural heritage sites in their natural and cultural setting and social context. 4. Respect the authenticity of cultural heritage sites by communicating the significance of their historic fabric and cultural values and protecting them from adverse impact of intrusive interpretive infrastructure, visitor pressure, inaccurate or inappropriate interpretation. 5. Contribute to the sustainable conservation of cultural heritage sites through promoting public understanding of and in participation in ongoing conservation efforts, ensuring long-term maintenance of the interpretive infrastructure and regular review of its interpretive contents. 6. Encourage inclusiveness in the interpretation of cultural heritage sites by facilitating the involvement of stakeholders and associated communities in the development and implementation of interpretive programs. And 7. Develop technical and professional guidelines for heritage interpretation and presentation, including technologies, research, and training. Such as guidelines must be appropriate and sustainable in their social context. These definitions and principles apply equally well to all heritage sites, whether cultural or natural. Interpretation and presentation are important both to improve the understanding by people of the site and to inform the appropriate management of the heritage site itself, since interpretation helps to provide a clear understanding of the values which have to be protected. A sensitive treatment is essential if multiple communities are concerned. with possible divergent or conflicting perceptions. Interpretation is an essential component of the management of sites with memorial aspects, since it is important to present an inclusive, often nuanced narrative. Interpretation of contested sites can raise difficult issues, particularly when there are different views of the significance or history of a particular place. Yet, it can also present opportunities to bring communities from different perspectives together through the very process of thoughtfully and inclusively developing the site interpretation. The interpretation of conflicted sites needs special attention and care in order to avoid deepening divides. And since 2003, the UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage offers a good alternative for places with active living traditions. Awareness for association-like practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills may be raised to the international level through inscription on the representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. And this convention has the added benefit of protecting the associated cultural spaces, like buildings and cities that support the practices. Also, UNESCO Memory of the World program is an alternative path for the recognition of documentary heritage, which, while associated with place, does not meet the requirements for the use of Criterion 6, in that there is no place-based evidence related to the events documented. Literary works and other documentary heritage may be listed in the Memory of the World Register on condition that they meet conservation and accessibility requirements. Historical narratives are important elements of cultural heritage. They play a decisive role in collective identity, with people striving to retrieve, validate, make known, and have acknowledged by others their own history on one hand, and contesting interpretation on the other. How we learn and what we know about our past can either strengthen peace or respect for the human rights, or maintain and actually exacerbate divisions and tensions among different groups of society. Therefore, we have to be very careful, as the inscription of a site of memory on the World Heritage List cements a singular narrative at the moment in time and fossilize it rather than allow for multiple narratives and dissonant memories to be explored. Putting the international recognition provided by UNESCO on one narrative, it could interfere with ongoing reconciliation processes, support agendas of exclusions, and potentially reignite divisions among stakeholders. And clearly, this is not in line with the spirit of the World Heritage Convention or UNESCO Constitution. And with this, I will thank you very much for your attention. And I wish all the other speakers all the best.
Thank you, Mr. Balsamo, for your very informative presentations. Mr. Balsamo recalled the ICOMOS Charter, which sets out 7 principal objectives for interpretations. Our next speaker is Professor William Logan. He's a professor emeritus of Taken University, and he has published extensively on cultural heritage, particularly in relations to human rights, peace, and security, among other topics. Today, he will share with us his ideas on a set of principles for heritage interpretation. Professor Logan, good to see you again.
Thank you, Jensen
Yes.
John.
Yeah.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Korean National Commission for UNESCO, for involving me in this project and in this conference. Heritage interpretation is the process of attributing meaning and significance to elements from the past, whether these are tangible places, documents, and other artifacts, or intangible and embodied skills, practices, and traditions. Interpretation is the intellectual foundation on which the very concept of heritage is built, and it's a critical element in all programs aimed at heritage protection. The initial identification of an element to be investigated for its heritage value is already an act of interpretation. It underlies the decision that a particular element is significant for the present and should be protected for the future. In the World Heritage arena, it is interpretation of the outstanding universal value that sets in train a work program leading to submission of the nomination dossier to the World Heritage Committee. In other words, it's the start of quite a long process. The Australian ICOMOS Borough Charter explains this well. In its three-stage values-based process for safeguarding heritage places, heritage interpretation comes first. The Charter says, understanding cultural significance comes first, then development of policy, and finally management of the place in accordance with the policy. Other national charters from Canada and China to New Zealand, Turkey, and the United States also see interpretation as the start of the protection process. Since 2005, the World Heritage Committee's operational guidelines have followed this approach too, indicating in Article 51 that the statement of OUV is the key reference for future effective protection and management of the property. Interpretation enables visitors to a place, and by visitors, there are many kinds: people who visit physically, people viewing places online or reading about them in books and brochures. Interpretation enables these visitors to a place to make sense of it, with the important proviso that the interpretation is effectively communicated using appropriate presentation techniques. I want to stress that interpretation and presentation are different processes, although they go hand in hand. Put simply, interpretation is what you say. Presentation is how you communicate the interpretation to the visitors. Sometimes difficulties arise because an interpretation is insufficient, inappropriate, incomplete, or just totally inept. Sometimes problems lie in the way the interpretation is presented, communicating site values poorly. Distinguishing clearly between interpretation and presentation helps to minimize the confusion that's crept into much practice, even the ICOMOS Charter mentioned by Alessandro Balsamo. The confusion has crept into practice, and we need to prepare more successful interpretation and presentation strategies, and to enable more effective remedial action in heritage protection programs where it's needed. My presentation tonight, or this morning, or wherever you are, focuses on interpretation, however, rather than presentation. Interpretation is not well developed in many heritage sites around the world, including some of those inscribed on the World Heritage List. In many cases, only brief technical interpretations of the main site structures are provided, while other site values and meanings are downplayed or ignored. Interpreting heritage places also is an essentially political process that can have both good and bad effects within states and internationally. Domestically, heritage interpretation go, on the one hand, to play a major role in nation building, with governments using heritage in their efforts to create and maintain community cohesion around a set of core values. On the other hand, social justice and human rights become involved when the powerful impose their view of what is significant onto others. This can become institutionalized as an oppressive, authorized heritage discourse, to use Laura Jane Smith's term, that works against minority cultures within the state, representing a form of internal colonization. The interpretation presented to site visitors normally fits the official narrative and attempts to include other views can quickly run into official opposition. This does not mean that such attempts should be abandoned. Indeed, it makes the goal of achieving multidimensional site interpretation even more important. Many visitors want the site to be set into a broad historical and geographical context and are put off when the only interpretation of a site is provided, and that is ideology-bound and propagandistic. Internationally, heritage interpretation may enable the identification of cultural commonalities between neighbouring states or with more distant non-contiguous states, creating and strengthening harmonious international relations. Heritage interpretation that highlights differences or implies relationships of power asymmetry between states, however, may upset international relations and provide a rationale for various forms of conflict, military aggression, and diplomatic trade and aid tensions, for example. After military conflicts have officially ceased, contested heritage interpretations may continue to shape relations between the formerly warring states. In commemorating wars, each side seeks to portray the conflict in ways that appeal both to its own citizens and to international audiences. Underlying aims may include victim diplomacy, in which culpability for the war or episodes within it are avoided and intergenerational guilt is lessened. This presentation is not the place to dwell on the specifics of such disputes. I've written recently in the Journal of Cultural Heritage Management and Sustainable Development on a range of these disputes. It's sufficient here to make 2 points. First, that such disputes are worldwide and not only between states, but also between communities within states. And second, that the disputes could have been avoided if more sensitive interpretation of the sites at the time of nomination and inscription had been undertaken, more fully representing the views of all state parties involved in the international conflict. Interpreting sites in countries still in post-conflict mode is especially difficult. It may simply be too soon for some war-related sites to be interpreted in a balanced and objective way and seen in a broad historical and geographical context. However, great care needs to be taken to ensure that the interpretation presented at sites, as in museums, does not exacerbate tensions persisting from the past. As my colleague Dr. Ege Yildirim has pointed out, this is admittedly a challenge to balance this care with the natural need felt by human communities to proclaim emotionally powerful and identity-building narratives of patriotism, pride, courage, sacrifice, and honour. Such a balancing act can benefit from other parts of the human emotional spectrum, such as empathy, humility, and respect for alternative points of view, which underlie principles of peace and human rights. Support can be given in this by disciplines not usually brought into the conservation process, such as psychology, social psychology, which can help us address the motivations that give rise to problematic narratives. UNESCO has taken some steps in recent years to clarify what needs to be done in relation to the interpretation of sites related to memories of recent conflicts. And our previous speaker has talked about this. I'll make a few additional points. This became urgent, as Alessandro Balsamo mentioned, over the last decade, as the number of such sites being considered for inscription grew rapidly. Until 2010, only 3 such sites had been World Heritage listed: Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial at Gimbaku Dome, and the Bikini Atoll nuclear test site. But by 2018, 11 new nominations had been tabled, 2 for the World Heritage List and 9 for the tentative list. The anticipation of further troubles in its sessions led the World Heritage Committee to impose a temporary halt in processing nominations until a comprehensive reflection on all relevant issues could be taken, including whether and how sites associated with recent conflicts and other negative and divisive memories might relate to the purpose and scope of the World Heritage Convention. ICOMOS led this review, and its final report, published in February 2020, concluded that inscribing such sites would not be in line with a positive message of OUV and the UNESCO peace mandate. Adoption of the report's recommendations would, of course, remove one source of tension from UNESCO's World Heritage Programme. Debate on the matter at the World Heritage Committee, its extended session in July 2021, was inconclusive. And as Alessandro Bassano said, further discussions will take place. Other important changes have been set in train by the UN Secretary General's decision in 2011 to prepare a post-2015 development agenda based on the notion of sustainable development. What's particularly significant is the comprehensive way in which sustainability was envisaged in developing this development agenda. No longer the familiar narrow approach relating to the physical environment, but as a concept dependent on three overarching principles: human rights, equality, and long-term sustainability, and four main sets of factors: environmental sustainability, equality, social development, inclusive economic development, and the fostering of peace and security. Of particular relevance to this presentation is that the UN's vision directly links sustainability to the attainment and maintenance of peace and security, and to the avoidance of lives lost and heritage damaged or destroyed. The UN Security Council went further in 2017 when it made the milestone decision to condemn the unlawful destruction of cultural heritage as a war crime. Now, as a member of the UN family of institutions, UNESCO decided that it had a responsibility to promote this UN agenda and to ensure that all its programs adhered to the sustainable development principles and factors. A policy for the integration of a sustainable development perspective within the Heritage Convention was adopted in November 2015. It's important to note that unlike declarations and recommendations and other UNESCO statements, a policy is, like conventions, legally binding on all UNESCO member states. In the case of World Heritage, compliance with this World Heritage and Sustainable Development Policy is checked through reactive and periodic reporting. While the operational guidelines have been adjusted to take on board much of the World Heritage and Sustainable Development Policy, they remain very quiet on interpretation. Paragraph 7 simply reminds readers that the Convention aims at the identification, i.e. interpretation, protection, conservation, presentation, and transmission to future generations of cultural and natural heritage of outstanding universal value. Elsewhere in the guidelines, the term interpretation is used to mean techniques for presenting information to tourists and other visitors. Not only is the distinction between interpretation and presentation poorly conveyed, but nothing at all is said about ensuring accurate and balanced interpretation. This is a gap that needs to be filled. It's not that interpretation hasn't been occurring, but often the interpretation was articulated further along the process and not at the beginning. Often the interpretation was retrofitted to the data that had already been gathered about sites. It needs to come at the beginning of the nomination process, and it needs to acknowledge the fundamental and overarching principle on which all UNESCO's activities are based, which is to support a culture of peace and intercultural dialogue. A clearly enunciated set of principles for heritage interpretation is needed. It would give teams preparing dossiers some guidance on how to proceed that is in line with UNESCO's basic principle of supporting a culture of peace and intercultural dialogue. If we were to enunciate such a set of principles, what might they be? I'm going to suggest 5 possible principles, and these would need to be redrafted and worked on, of course, but here's some ideas. The first principle might be exactly what I've just been saying, that the heritage interpretation shall support UNESCO's fundamental objective of building bridges to peace. This principle means that heritage interpretation must help to promote a culture of peace. It must not create, exacerbate, or prolong tensions between states parties, nor should it threaten peace and security between and within states parties. A second principle might be that the interpretation shall support a human rights-based approach to the safeguarding of places of cultural heritage significance. Article 1.1 of the UNESCO Constitution makes clear that collaboration among the nations through education, science, and culture is aimed at furthering, and I quote, universal respect for justice, for the rule of law, and for the human rights and fundamental freedoms which are affirmed for the peoples of the world without distinction of race, sex, language, or religion by the Charter of the United Nations. Paragraph 12 of the 2019 version of the operational guidelines indicates that states parties to the convention are encouraged, perhaps that's too weak a word, are encouraged to adopt a human rights-based approach. Third principle might be that heritage interpretation shall respect cultural diversity. The NARA document on authenticity in 1994 set a new tone for the operation of the World Heritage Convention by calling for greater respect for cultural diversity. And this is picked up in paragraphs 81 and 111 of the operational guidelines. Principle 4 might be something along the lines that the heritage interpretation shall reflect multiple voices about the significance of the place. This means that the heritage interpretation must be seen to reflect a set of possibly diverging views held by a wide range of stakeholders and rights holders. And fifthly, the heritage interpretation shall be in keeping with the principles of sustainable development. So in conclusion, I think you can see that none of these 5 principles actually contain new ideas. The ideas are already there in the documents already approved by UNESCO and ICOMOS and so on. The important change will be to apply them to the interpretation of heritage places at the start of and guiding the whole protection process. Thank you very much for listening to me. Bye.
Thank you, Professor Logan, for your very insightful presentations. Professor Logan emphasized the need for clear principles for heritage interpretation. He also suggested 5 possible principles. Our next speaker is Professor Peter Bill Larsen. Professor Larsen is currently lecturing at the University of Geneva, addressing issues of environmental civil society spaces, heritage and transboundary conservations. And today he will give us his thoughts on enablers of equitable heritage interpretation. Professor Larsen? Good to see you again.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yeah, good to see you. Thank you so much, Mr. Jin Sung Joon. And indeed, thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me, again, showing your commitment to long-term conversations around issues of interpretation. World Heritage interpretation. Now, I would like to try to show you also a PowerPoint presentation. And indeed, I think I'm very happy to have this presentation building on the important comments and conversations we've had from the previous speakers, really setting the scene about showing how this is a long-term conversation that's now moving into basically clarifying what kinds of principles and good practices that might actually help us move towards what I would call equitable, or what we've seen also been called inclusive World Heritage interpretation. So what in fact can actually get us there? And I think that also, I want to try to speak a little bit more then to the title of this meeting, that is this idea of not only the principles, but also the ways forward, as was highlighted. So what are these conditions that might enable us to be more inclusive and more equitable in the ways we deal with heritage interpretation? Now, we've seen that this is a massive issue. It's been highlighted, underlined by Alessandro, by Bill Logan, and so on, that this concerns a whole range of different sites. It concerns also different elements, different aspects, different phases of the management cycle, and so on. So we know that. And at the same time, we, of course, have hopes and have had hopes throughout the history of the convention, the 50 years of the convention, that this was a convention that would allow for the highest standards to deal with cultural and natural heritage. But we also have hopes, of course, attached to our different frameworks, our operational guidelines, now moving into indeed the need for more principles. But I also think it's important to think about other enabling factors like practices, good practices, the capacities of our partners in this, and also fundamentally whether there's willingness or not to address interpretation in that full range of potentialities that we see. And I think that was very much also underlined by the introductory remarks, that there has been obviously this shift from just looking at the material dimension towards looking at it in a broader social context and so on. But this also I think we need to take forward in understanding what actually are the conditions, the enabling conditions we have to move towards a more inclusive interpretive approach. Now, we have, of course, spoken a lot today about the kinds of conflicts we've seen around heritage interpretation. And some might say, well, that in some ways signals our failure to deal with these long-standing differences, inequalities, legacies of exclusion, a tendency to have a top-down approach, mainly focused on outstanding universal values, ignoring other values, etc. It might, of course, also be criticized for indeed actually slowing down heritage protection measures because of all that conflict and missed opportunities to cooperate. And certainly what we've seen for many actors is that it's been extremely costly in terms of firefighting, damage mitigation, and again, lost opportunities to cooperate. Yet, at the same time, all of that is, of course, also a new opportunity to start reckoning about how to deal with these differences, recognize them, and potentially move towards reconciliation. And I'll try to get back with a couple of short examples just to show, in fact, how useful it is when countries do start reckoning with those past legacies and try to deal with it. So we have, in a sense, even though it doesn't look like an enabling condition, conflict and so on are, of course, also good opportunities to start to explore new and more equitable pathways. And just to sort of speak to the topic of principles that was so well presented also by Professor Bill Logan, is this whole issue of equity and human rights being at the center stage of UNESCO, and it has been so for a long time, we might say for its 75 years of existence, but increasingly also in the World Heritage context through principles around this. So what does this actually mean? Well, what I think we need to underline is that conflict may enable new approaches, but there are also less painful, we might say, enablers that can move us in that direction. And what are they then? Well, one, I think, is indeed to actually awaken what I would say, awaking the sleeping beauty, awaking that whole UNESCO spirit that was established by its very foundation, its constitution, about building peace. That's been highlighted by other speakers as well. Let's not forget that this was an organization born with a purpose. As the host of the World Heritage Convention, we have these important meta values of dialogue, peace, and coexistence. And I think there's no point any longer in trying to keep that as something separate from the normative space of the World Heritage Convention. Obviously, the World Heritage Convention, if anything, should contribute towards the implementation of these fundamental values that keep UNESCO members together: dialogue, peace, and coexistence. So that's the enabling condition one. We really need to sort of make that link much clearer and much stronger. And the second one is indeed what was also stressed by previous speakers, is this importance of clarifying what are actually good principles and practices of World Heritage interpretation. Right now, we have a bit of a vacuum. We have a bit of a vacuum which leaves states, parties in a limbo with unclear definitions, and we need to shift towards having much better definitions and clear standards for what is considered good practice for World Heritage interpretation. If we stay in this space now of unclear principles and sort of lack of clear rules around this, we are caught up in very arbitrary practice. So what can we learn indeed from good practice happening? And here I'm thinking, for example, of World Heritage sites like Pimachuana Key in Canada, inscribed in 2018, where one just sees, of course, in a settler country like Canada, an effort to deal with colonial legacies, an effort to deal with histories of exclusion, and actually looking at how that can be translated into also matters of World Heritage designation, but also interpretation. And I've highlighted, given the time constraints here, I've highlighted just a few words here that I found extremely interesting and useful. One, for example, under goal 3 in their management plan, was to develop community protocols to inform visitors about the need to be respectful of all aspects of the living cultural landscape. So here, in a sense, we see a strong emphasis of something also being much more inclusive, of engaging with community protocol development, and what that means in very practical terms also for things like signage, brochures, regional media, and other means. What I find interesting also in this goal 3 is it actually connects 3 different elements. So the first element we've seen is this issue of community protocols, a bottom-up approach, in a sense, a recognition that some perspectives, some modalities of interpretation have been excluded, and exploring ways of including them by actually having communities developing their own protocols. But the second dimension insists also upon the World Heritage Site as conducted in accordance with UNESCO guidelines. I like this in a sense because it connects with what I was saying about the enabling dimension number 1 or 2, about actually awakening that sleeping beauty that we have with us. This 75-year-old grandmother, UNESCO, that in a sense has really was established on a certain set of ideas, aspirations, hopes, and meta-values that need to guide us, that need to guide the way we think about these issues and think them together. And the last third element I really appreciate in their management plan here was this emphasis about engaging students and the public in learning about and caring. So in a sense, let's not forget again that at the end of the day, we're dealing with real people living with this, and it's about living together and coexistence. It connects again with our meta values. Another element that we sometimes tend to forget a bit, but I think is so extremely important, and it's something I've learned a lot from colleagues in UNESCO, colleagues in ICOMOS, colleagues in IUCN, colleagues in ICROM, is that you can only do so much without, or maybe put that the other way around, that a lot of the good things we see, a lot of the new ways of dealing with all these aspects comes from good professionals. Good heritage professionals that are willing to try out new things, that are enabled also to try out new things, And here it's about building the skills and tools for professionals to be much more proactive in inclusive heritage understanding and inclusive heritage interpretation that moves it out of that narrow space of OUV and is able to actually engage and understand with the broader set of values and potentialities. So I think it's really important that we think about this as a strong enabling condition, that we make sure that any efforts to build capacity at national, regional, and global levels really enhances the skills of professionals and creates those shared learning spaces where we can learn and innovate together and raise the bar in a sense. So one thing is, of course, to set the bar high in terms of new principles, but another thing is, I think, really creating those enabling spaces where we can learn and work together towards more inclusive forms of World Heritage interpretation. So I couldn't help also included this quote going to another settler country, Australia, with the 2019 inscription of Butch Beam. But I was very touched by the quote by Auntie Iris Lovett Gardner, who said, "Walking the land is important to us because we love the land. The land talks to us, it sings songs, it talks to us. Even the birds tell us things. Each animal's got a story to tell. We've still got those things. They're still here. They're very important. This is spirituality we walk this land and we listen and we see and we hear them all because we love the land and we get messages from this and that." I very much appreciate this quote because it speaks about the different voices, the different songs, and the different spaces that always exist in our World Heritage sites. And an enabling condition here is our ability to listen. And as Alessandro Balsamo insisted upon, also with criterion 6 and so on, this whole dimension of memory and association is so essential to all sites, potential to all sites, that it's something we need to reckon with. And in that sense, we need to become better at listening and not shy away from having different perspectives and values in that respect. So I think just very briefly from these two couple of cases, again, we're talking about settler countries with legacies of exclusion, but also contemporary practices of exclusion, and indeed exploring the World Heritage sites as places of encounter, and in a sense, also as spaces of reconciliation. And I think it's very important we learn from those practices, we build on them, and we take that forward. So for me, I want to conclude with, I see that our time is almost up. I would say that there are grounds for optimism. There are grounds for optimism in a sense that we now acknowledge today that this topic of World Heritage interpretation is fundamental, but it needs also to clarify the principles at stake. And it needs to actually establish that as a common framework for all states parties, but by awakening our grandmother, the sleeping queen, UNESCO, 75 years old, with the meta values that indeed guide us or should guide us in terms of what World Heritage interpretation should be about. That being said, I also think that what I've tried to stress here in this presentation is that we do have multiple entry points to start enabling all this. While we can have we should push for and indeed, argue that the World Heritage Convention needs clear principles around this. This won't be a one-size-fits-all arrangement either. Rather, it's about acknowledging that we're dealing with a diversity of practices on the ground, and that changing practice will take time and practice. So we need to practice more. And for that, we also need to get the practitioners on board and create those enabling spaces for them. And I do think that the work that's being done in Korea to work on this, both through the efforts on establishing further guidance around this, but also in terms of creating learning, there's been a wonderful speaking series around this as well, is starting to create that conversation among practitioners and starting to say, this is something that we can talk about and move forward with. So with those words, I would just like again to thank the organizers for inviting me to share some thoughts around this, and I look forward to also hear what the panel discussion will bring afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Larsen, for your very inspiring presentation with a very positive message in it. And Professor Larsen highlighted 5 enabling conditions for more inclusive and equitable heritage interpretations. Our last speaker is Mr. Tok-Sun Kim. He's currently serving as a chief of the Planning and Establishment Unit at the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentations of World Heritage Sites. He will tell us about the center and its action plan for the future. Mr. Kim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning and good evening, all the participants. I'm Tok-Sun Kim, the director of the Preparatory Office of the International Center for Interpretation and Presentation of World Heritage Site under the auspices of UNESCO, which is known as WHIPIC. First, I would like to express my thanks to the audience who are interested in this meeting, and especially thanks to the Korean National Commission for UNESCO who organized this meeting even during the difficult times of COVID-19 pandemics. Unlike the theoretical approach presented earlier, I would like to focus on how the newly established WHIPIC will approach the heritage interpretation and presentation in a practical manner. The WHIPIC is an UNESCO category center established to understand and protect World Heritage and to effectively implement the 1972 World Heritage Convention with an approach of heritage interpretation and presentations. It is being prepared with the aim of the official establishment in Korea on the January of 2022. The center will carry out various activities on research and capacity building and information and networking in the field of heritage interpretation and presentation. The preparatory office of the WHIPIC is establishing mid and long-term development plan from 2020 to 2031 that contains future direction and the strategy of the center. In particular, I would like to inform you that the following the manner reflected in the mid and long-term planning, such as first, all the center's activity should be consistent with the strategy of the UNESCO and the purpose and spirit of the World Heritage Convention. And second, that it will maintain inclusive heritage interpretation and effective presentation approach. And then the communication and cooperation with the partner are the most important for implementing our activities. Based on our mid and long-term development plan, now I'm going to describe the WHIPIC's strategic direction rather than a specific project. WHIPIC has a vision to spread the win-win value of the heritage that connected time and space by implementing our mission to enhance the diversity of the value in world heritage through the inclusive heritage interpretation and presentations. So we consider heritage interpretation and presentation as a dynamic and long-term and constant process to understand overall importance of the heritage within the wide range of the context. Therefore, continuous research and education and training and access and utilization of information and the spread of stakeholder to community will be the core of our center's activities. To do this, we set up the 4 strategic objectives and 8 implementing tasks by focusing on the 4 the key functions. At first, I would like to explain the strategic goal on research. The importance of and the interest in the World Heritage interpretation and presentation are increasing internationally. But I think there is still a lack of the academic and practical research related to this area. Therefore, the center aims to support the active pursuance of international research on heritage interpretation and presentation from the more inclusive perspective. For more effective international research on heritage interpretation and presentation, the center intends to promote various in-depth research and support international research infrastructure and facilitate emerging researchers. The various in-depth study will include the basic research such as the term, concept, principle, and standard for heritage interpretation. And then the research by subject linked to the human right and community and sustainable development. And then convergence study with other fields such as education and tourism and media. In addition, the recent concern and interest in the World Heritage in conflicts are growing, so we would like to provide a venue for research and academic discussion to effectively deal with this issue. Meanwhile, in order to effectively implement such a research, we will also strive to create a research infrastructure, such as a research platform in the form of the academic seminar, and then to establish research database on information and stakeholder relating to the heritage interpretations. Also, in order to expand heritage interpretation research from the long-term and new perspective, we would like to facilitate support for emerging researchers through the international research contest and global North and South forum and so on. Along with this research activity, we are interested in providing various discussion platform for this research activity, leading to the international or national policy change in practical manner. We expect that these research activities will eventually contribute to the establishment of the theoretical and policy foundation, and then the formation of international discourse on heritage interpretation and presentation as an alternative for protecting World Heritage Site. Secondly, along with the research activities, we think capacity building for stakeholder and awareness raising of the importance of heritage interpretation and presentations are essential for protecting World Heritage Site. In this sense, we would like to implement customized capacity building program for each target, such as university and site manager and policymaker, by providing the development of heritage interpretation curriculum or educational manuals. In addition, we would like to conduct online education, publication, and various public events to enhance awareness and understanding of the importance of heritage interpretation among the young people and the publics. Meanwhile, we are planning to provide support for the establishing and implementing interpretation strategy for the World Heritage Site inscribed within the state party of the convention. For this, we would like to strengthen the ability of the member state to establish heritage interpretation strategy by providing capacity building programs. In addition, by providing technical and financial support, we would like to support for the state party to establish actual the World Heritage interpretation strategy, and then to monitor its implementation, and then to discover and share their best practice. I believe that this will contribute enhancing visitors' understanding and experience of the World Heritage Site. So thirdly, I will talk about the information function to strengthen the sharing and utilization of the World Heritage interpretation informations. In order to implement the effective information function, the center will first establish an information system on heritage interpretation, including various meaning and value and protection method and activities. Through this, we hope that information on heritage interpretation and presentation will be shared and utilized by researchers and policymakers and community. Additionally, if necessary, we would like to support the establishment of a National Heritage Interpretation Archive too. Furthermore, I think it is important not only to collect and manage information, but also increase the access and the utilization of information. To this end, we intend to strengthen the understanding and the accessibility to the information on the World Heritage Site by using information technology, and then to develop various education and economic content from the heritage interpretation informations. In particular, I would like to stress that it is important to use low information technology rather than high technology to access and share the heritage interpretation information around the world. In this regard, we need a lot of ideas in the coming futures. Finally, we would like to increase the cooperation and solidarity with the international stakeholders. The activity on research and capacity building and information mentioned earlier will not be effectively implemented without close cooperation and participation of the partners. I think it is more possible through the collaboration with the various related parties, such as member state, expert, and professional organizations and NGOs. In particular, we are paying close attention to the role of civil society and NGOs in heritage interpretation and presentations. To this end, we would like to establish network platform by region and subject and target to conduct regular discussion and cooperation on related issues. Moreover, we would like to strengthen comprehensive human cooperation too with global partners through the personal exchange, such as international fellowship and internship. So far, I have emphasized the role of heritage interpretation and presentation as an alternative to the World Heritage protection, and have talked about the direction of the center's activity. Of course, the further effective implementation of this activity under the various restrictions, it is necessary to prioritize and approach them step by step. In this sense, I think the wide range of discussion and consensus on the term and principle of World Heritage interpretation, which are also linked to the theme of today's meeting, should be dealt with at the international and national level. Therefore, the thought and idea of the earlier presenter on the term and principle of heritage interpretation are important, and I think this opportunity should be further expanded. The WHIPIC want to take a new step to protecting World Heritage Site. We are also well aware of the many people's interest and expectation for the center. However, we cannot continue our successful journey without your active participation. In this sense, I strongly emphasize that the center is always open-minded and then ready to listen carefully to your opinion and to cooperate. This is all my presentation today. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you, Mr. Kim, for your very informative presentations, and we look forward to seeing more active role played by the WHIPIC in the future. Over the past hours, we have listened to 4 very interesting presentations with thought-provoking ideas. Now we will move on to panel discussions with our speakers, together with the additional discussants. This discussion session will be chaired by Professor Kyung-ho Seo. Professor Seo is an emeritus professor of Seoul National University. He served as a dean of the College of Liberal Studies at the Seoul National University, and he was also a former member of the International Advisory Committee for UNESCO Memory of the World Program. Please welcome Professor Seo.
Thank you, Jin-sung. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are located. We're going through a very tight schedule without having any break between the first part and second part. Anyway, welcome to the second part for discussion. And I'm personally very happy and honored to be invited as the moderator of the international dialogue to address this significant task of World Heritage interpretation. Based on the 4 inspiring presentations in the first part, we'll proceed to the discussions, inviting 4 discussants one by one. Let me briefly remark a little bit about a protocol. Most of the questions will be dealt with after your discussions are over. But if you have any question for which you would like to have immediate response from a particular presenter, a speaker, then please specify it. Then I'll give you time to have a one-to-one dialogue before we proceed to next discussant. Did I make it clear? Okay, first let me invite Professor Richard McKay from Australia for his discussion. Mr. McKay, would you please take the floor?
Thank you, Professor Seo. Can I begin by extending my thanks to the Korean National Commission for UNESCO and to the organisers for the opportunity to participate in this global event. And I thank each of the presenters for their provocative and thoughtful contributions. It seems to me, reflecting on the presentations which we've heard this evening, this morning, this afternoon, or late tonight if you're in Sydney, Australia, as I am, that the core issue hinges around the fact that we are discussing interpretation in a World Heritage context. And therefore, I think, as my colleague Alessandro Balsamo very eloquently outlined, we are very much bound within the framework of the World Heritage Convention and its operational guidelines as they have evolved over the 50 years of the operation of the convention. And it is not at all surprising that at this stage in the convention's life, that the committee is very actively turning its mind to issues that relate to sites of memory, sites with contested histories, sites which are places of conflict, perhaps of pain, because as the convention has matured and as different types of place have been added with a much broader range of values, we have moved into very difficult territory. However, I think the concept of the convention, and particularly the notion of outstanding universal value, creates as much a challenge as it does an opportunity. And this was, I think, particularly highlighted by my friend and colleague, Professor Bill Logan, when he reminded us that the convention tells us that the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value is the key reference in the World Heritage space. It is the touchstone around which requirements for conservation and management, the state of conservation of the property hinges. Now, this is all very well if one has got a simple property with simple values that are not matters of contest or matters of multiple dialogue. But it's highly problematic where there is one set of information, one set of attributes, and one set of values that is reflected in the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value. And yet, there may be other dialogues, other values, and other perspectives that also attach to that place. And this is where we fall into the dilemma of the authorised heritage discourse, if I could also quote Laura Jane Smith, that the official Statement of Outstanding Universal Value, which is normally adopted by the committee at the moment of inscription, at that very time confers an authorised discourse, which in turn is what the state party is obliged to protect, to manage, and to convey to future generations under the convention. And yet herein we have a paradox, and the paradox arises because of Article 4 of the convention and the fact that Article 4 actually obliges state parties not only to look out for those values which are enshrined in outstanding universal value, but indeed all of the cultural and natural values that attach to heritage, not just heritage that's inscribed on the World Heritage List. So I think we do have quite an interesting challenge, and it comes about as the convention has matured and places with a greater diversity of values, and particularly, if I might use this term, New World values of settled and colonial states are increasingly recognised. And I think we've seen this particularly in recent years, certainly in the two examples that Peter Billy Larson highlighted. The Pemawatchian Aki example, by its very nature, in the manner in which it came to the committee, it was a matter of dispute. The nomination was withdrawn. There was dialogue with traditional custodians, and the multiple discourse, the multiple values were recognised. I think paved the way for a much more successful and smooth process with the inscription only at the session in 2019 of the Budgebim Cultural Landscape, where this very deep set of relationships between contemporary people and an ancient culture reflected in country is much better articulated and represented in the statement of OUV. And so I think we do end up with a challenge for interpretation, and that challenge is that for many of the places that are already on the World Heritage List and have not been through the difficult journey of Pemawatchian Aki or the easier journey of Budgebim, we have places that are inscribed for a select official set of attributes and values at the time of their inscription. And I might conclude by just drawing attention, for example, to places within my own country, Australia. Some decades ago, the Uluru property was inscribed on the World Heritage List. It was initially inscribed predominantly for natural values associated with the fact that the Uluru Rock is the largest monolith in the world. It was subsequently reinscribed under Criterion 6 as a cultural landscape of deep spiritual meaning to the Yanangu people. It's an example of the state party and the traditional custodians being able to recognise and remedy this issue about multiple values and multiple stories that need to be interpreted. And yet, as I speak, we have another World Heritage Area in Australia, the Greater Blue Mountains, which is currently subject to a major infrastructure project that would flood part of the inscribed World Heritage Area. One of the key values of the area that would be flooded, one of the key sets of values, is a set of cultural values, Indigenous sites and places of meaning to traditional custodians. And yet these stories are not told. These are not World Heritage values. There's not a trigger for involvement of either the national government because of World Heritage legislation, nor the World Heritage Committee, because the Greater Blue Mountains is inscribed under criteria 9 and 10. It's inscribed for natural values, and yet it is in fact an ancient and highly regarded, much loved cultural landscape of tremendous importance to 6 different sets of traditional custodians. And so there is a huge challenge and problem there about how that story is told, how that site is interpreted, because the very nature of the conferring of OUV at the time of inscription does as much to exclude stories and narratives as it does to include them. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor McKay. Next, we turn to Professor biehoroz. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Sorry if I was not. Okay, are you ready to take the floor briefly?
Yes, thank you very much. I will be brief just in the name of time, and thank you all for your invitation to participate in this discussion. Thank you to the organizers and to my fellow speakers and panelists for all of your contributions. I think really I had a series of questions that I wanted to pose to the speakers who came before. And one of my questions was really for Mr. Balsamo. And it's about, but perhaps the rest of us can think about it as well, and it's about the synergies between the different conventions and the different programs that UNESCO has, and how we can make, I know that's a fashionable word at the moment, synergies, so I hesitate a little bit to use it, but how can we really make these conventions work together and the programs work together in the way that Mr. Balsamo was suggesting, that sense of, if criteria 6 is the one that links the tangible and the intangible together, but how can we make this work together better, and also linking up to the Memory of the World program and linking up to the Biosphere of Man program as well, and bringing in this sense that Richard McKay just talked about of cultural landscapes. How can we really get these different conventions, these different tools that we have, to really work together in a way that doesn't create these false dichotomies and binaries in heritage, that on the one end we have natural, the other end we have cultural, one end we have intangible, the other. How can we really get these to work together? And this is something that in our classes, so to bring my teaching side to this discussion, so over the past week, we've had my MPhil students in heritage. We have had a role-playing exercise of pretending to be the World Heritage Committee. And I assigned all of the students different roles that they had to play. So some were representing different sections of the community. We used a British site, FlagFen, which isn't on the World Heritage Committee, but there's a lot of World Heritage site. But there's a lot of discussion about whether FlagFen should be nominated or not and how it should be nominated. So we use that as an example. And this is something that constantly comes up in the discussions, right? So we have the local business association, the local Royal Society for the Protection of Birds representative, as well as ICOMOS, UNESCO, the art historians, the archaeologists. We have all these different perspectives represented. And what constantly comes up is the kind of the clashes that have been created by trying to categorize heritage as one thing or another. So I wonder if there's a way of really bringing these together. How can the Memory of the World project serve the kind of purpose that those countries seeking to nominate sites of recent conflicts and of troubled histories and difficult histories for the World Heritage List be satisfied that there is a recognition of that history without it necessarily being a World Heritage Site? But how can, that same kind of status that comes with World Heritage Site be somehow managed or recognized with the Memory of the World program, and also the biosphere of mankind? So at the end of this training exercise that we do with our students, everybody votes. And over the past 3 years, the students have tended to vote at the end of the exercise that they think it makes more sense for a site like Flag Fen, which is a kind of in a cultural landscape, to be nominated as a biosphere of man rather than World Heritage Site. And I think that makes a lot of sense for them and as the conversations go. So again, I just wonder about these kind of ways of working around the false dichotomies that we create for heritage and how we might be able to do that. So there is also a proposal perhaps for Mr. Kim or for our colleagues in the Korean National Office and anybody else out there, perhaps Peter in Geneva or Bill over in Australia or Richard or in EGE, could we perhaps create a model United Nations, a model World Heritage Committee, and bring our students together to think about these sites on a regular basis, which also goes through the capacity building and training aims of the Category 2 Center for Heritage Interpretation. So that's one idea. And I was really interested in what Mr. Kim said about the archive. And this is something, and the use of archives in the National Heritage Interpretation Archives and how this might be developed. Because one of my students recently commented that he went to museums in London and that the labels and the panels all looked very new. Like they had been rewritten in the last few months, and they had been rewritten in order to take into consideration the current debates around decolonizing museums and really showing in these labels and interpreting these collections in a way that acknowledges the violence that sometimes went into collecting these objects, right? So that's great that the labels are changing, but what I would like to see is, in the same way as archaeologists have a stratigraphy of layers of earth, I would like to have a stratigraphy of the layers of interpretation. Not that the past interpretations just disappear and go into the rubbish bin, but the past interpretations get put into an archive too, so that then we are able to see and track how the interpretations change with time, because that's one thing that keeps coming up in all of our conversations, that there isn't a correct interpretation, that every moment in time has the interpretation of history, of the past, of the values, of what they need from their heritage in that given moment and what they want to transmit for the future. And that's constantly changing. So having a way of archiving the changes in how we interpret sites and recognizing that has to be a process. And like many of you have referenced Laura Jane Smith in terms of her authorized heritage discourse, but I think also her processual sense of heritage, that it's a process of meaning making, for which interpretation is a constant work in progress and not something that we can find a concrete solution to that we can kind of tie up and string. So those are my main things. And then just the final point that I wanted to make, building on what Richard McKay was saying earlier, this sense of dissonance. So we often talk about dissonance as being a problem, and that we need to deal with this problem of dissonance, right? And often, unfortunately, because of the origins of UNESCO, because of the peace building mission of UNESCO, because it's the first sentence of UNESCO's setting up, the idea of building peace in the minds of men and women, I think that there's been a tendency to ignore the dissonance, ignore the dark and dirty bits of heritage, and just really highlight the bits that can be about unifying and universal value and humanity. And that's understandable, but it's been problematic. And I think it's very encouraging to hear both Alessandra and Richard talking about how to really engage with the dissonance and engage with the difficult stuff and not pretend it's not there and not put it under a rug, but really try to deal with it and use it not because it's a problem, but because it's actually part of the richness of heritage. And if we actually engage head on with the dissonance and talk about it, then perhaps we can, as Richard mentioned in those two cases, those two examples that Peter had also mentioned, have a much richer path of travel towards eventual nominations for whatever, whether it's World Heritage status or Biosphere of Man or Memory of the World, that the whole process of getting to there can be actually what's worthwhile rather than the nomination itself, but all the conversations that go into the process of getting nominated in one way or the other. So that's just kind of embracing the dissonance and not shying away from it, I think, is my kind of take-home message that I'd like to communicate. But thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Thank you. Oh, Dr. Yildirim, you are there. I thought you were just briefly away. Okay. It's your turn to take the floor.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Su. Apologies for the connection problems. I think they're also due to the severe winds we have in Istanbul this week. They're famous winds, local heritage, natural heritage winds of Lodos. Never get caught in an airplane landing in Istanbul during Lodos, which my sister did yesterday. So apologies for that. And thank you for the invitation. Wonderful to be here. Thanks to Jin-Sung and distinguished representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea and the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, of course. And congratulations again to WHIPIC for a very important new avenue that you're opening up for us. And thanks to all our esteemed colleagues who have provided all these inspirational and inspiring points already. It seems everything has already been said. So I'm probably just going to make some extra emphases on topics which really resonate and I could elaborate a little bit more on for you today. I think sustainable development as one of the principles that we are putting forth in our upcoming interpretation guidebook is where I'd like to enter with. We've already talked about the Sustainable Development Goals in a way with the 2015 UNESCO policy, which resonates with the classical three pillars of development, the social, the economic, the environmental aspects, adding to this peace and security in the UNESCO policy. This connects also to the 5 Ps, the 5 principles of the 2030 agenda, people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships. So the 5th P of partnerships is where we can connect to the next dot, I think, where the aspect of governance is something that heritage interpretation is closely tied with. And we've been, as colleagues have said, interpretation is really the intellectual fundamental essence of what we're doing, defining value. It's our starting point and the thread that carries the legitimacy of World Heritage all throughout. How we manage this really, the governance of it, who has actually put forth the values, who is it important for, who are the key actors who are making decisions or influencing what happens, what are their motivations, their characteristics. I think these all come into play, as already has been said. And I particularly really hope we've continued to focus on site management plans, the planning of it, and maybe not silo interpretation into too much of another stream, but see how it keys into site management planning. And that is already a strained tool. I mean, the relationship of site management with the wider context of how cities or countries are governed, the wider socioeconomic, political contexts in which we live, our actual habitats or ecosystems of these sites and our work, that's key. And this wider context, it brings us to the Sustainable Development Agenda, of course. And what we can do and how far we can go does depend on the development of certain factors. And Peter also talked about enabling conditions, how democratic institutions are developed, how civil society is developed, how the decision-making processes are, the methods of these decisions being made, and also the economic capacity of actors and countries, both for developing good management mechanisms, but also their economic priorities. And actually whether or not economic concerns color the way that we see value heritage itself. Here, some people might think of the North-South divide. The global North, the global South seem to be at odds in these committee discussions often, but that may actually be an artificial divide itself. Maybe it's not necessarily about that, but just one factor. And here, I would like to go back to what Professor Bill Logan mentioned briefly as Principle 5 on how heritage interpretation shall be in keeping with the principles of sustainable development. So we developed this together with Bill, and we did quote, forgive me if I'm repeating a little bit, that the UNESCO policy talks about in its Article 6, incorporating a sustainable development perspective that should embrace not only the protection of the OUV, but the well-being of present and future generations. Actually, something that struck me here is as if like OUV and well-being are very different things, and we need to make sure of them separately at the same time. Maybe we could also look at this in a way that OUV is for well-being, is part of well-being, and these things aren't necessarily that different from each other. Maybe that's a little change in our lens, I don't know. ICOMOS developed the policy guidance for SDGs this year, at the beginning of this year. There we also talk about this, the need to ensure that site management protects OUV while contributing to sustainable development, and that strengthening the dimensions of sustainable development is an essential part of the World Heritage Cycle. It needs to go hand in hand with defining the OUV from the beginning of the nomination process, where vast amounts of resources are deployed by states parties, through to conservation, management, and monitoring. And then we, here it seems maybe OUV and sustainability are trying to come more together. We're trying to talk about going hand in hand, but we're still talking about a duality while contributing. And then we've also talked about how heritage interpretations should take into account the relationship of the cultural heritage site with its built and natural environmental context. And here, a nod to Dathia, I think she really made an important point with the synergies between different conventions and the natural sphere. The economic dimension of the site's values, the social-cultural milieu where the site was created and continues to be valued. By the way, Dathia, just a quick reaction to your question from my side. This year at the HLPF, the high-level political forum where the UN convenes states parties to review progress on the SDGs, there was a side event that UNESCO actually organized called, I think it was the overarching title was Protected Areas for Sustainability, and that they actually did bring together all of the different conventions. So maybe, you know, the sustainability agenda is something we can use more often to bring those UNESCO tools together. So moving on from there, another point on interpretation and its wider context. We started off, with a reason, talking about memorial sites and sites of memory. But that's probably the most acute, the most visible arena where interpretation issues and importance comes to the surface. But it's actually, and I think it's not just memorial sites, it's all World Heritage. I think we all said things agreeing with that. All heritage can be handled through this interpretation lens because we start off by valuing things. Then I would like to continue, not too long, not to take up too much more time, just to touch briefly on some current emergent trends that we're seeing today, new ideas, things that are pushing society forward and in an uncomfortable, way out of our comfort zones. Well, one of the things is youth, really. talking about future generations. What are youth's priorities? What are their realities? What is generations Y or the millennials talking about that we may actually need to catch up with in our World Heritage arena? Well, the climate depression and anxiety is one thing. They are very much aware of the realities of climate. The World Heritage Convention has just brought out its updated climate policy, which is a really important key entry point. I'd like to come back to that, actually, the climate afterwards. We have information technology that is rapidly growing. I think there was an interesting point from the previous speakers on using low technology rather than high technology. I think there's merit in not overdoing the super fancy or super innovative technology, which has less people accessing it, but capacity building can enable more people to bridge the gap, the digital gap or the skills gap that we require. And information technology does have huge potential in portraying different interpretations at the same time, rather than having to use the same physical space, for example, having to choose one interpretation scheme over the other, but having more multiplicity digitally. Then there is decolonization, which has already been mentioned, of course. We have a colleague, George Obungu, you would know perhaps from different circles. We just had a message from him on Our World Heritage platform. He's in the African Union meeting, and they are talking about restitution as we speak, apparently. It's a huge topic in the African agenda. But not only there, of course, we saw Black Lives Matter. ICOMOS is talking about decolonizing heritage with its emerging professionals groups now, for example. And then another important thing there is the local context, which Alessandro started to talk about, and others, I think, as well. Well, there is local governments in this, but local actors, like Peter said, local professionals, bringing it into the local context where all of this value sits, actually. And here, maybe we need to ask ourselves, the protagonists of the convention being national governments, states parties, is this a challenge sometimes, or how do we make sure that states parties can help with this enabling environment? And I've seen in Turkey, in other places, that sometimes states parties are the biggest challenge. Forgive me for being a little bit subversive here. I think this is the tolerant platform to say these things. And how can we actually help the World Heritage Convention work with states parties to create enabling environments? We're going to have to expand the tools of the convention somehow. And I think the more we're forced to be going out of the regular tools of the convention, the more we are being relevant for the rest of society and sustainable development concerns. So just coming back as my last point to the climate issue, there is a huge justice component to the climate issue. The climate issue is not just about a natural crisis or planet and biodiversity crisis. It's also about a human crisis, and the inequity and conflict crisis has something to do with the climate crisis as well. And the human and environmental aspects are intertwined. And actually, how can interpretation as a more social equity issue support things like climate justice? How can peace building support collaboration and more effective action on climate mitigation and adaptation? Here, I'm thinking about, again, my own country, Turkey, and our neighbor across the sea, the Aegean Sea, Greece. And we have a common problem of SLR, sea level rise, and these are affecting archaeological sites, the coasts, among other things. And I'm hoping for the day when the Turkish and Greek governments come together, maybe the local governments come together and address joint action for cultural heritage protection in the face of sea level rise, for example. This is something I try to lobby sometimes about on Twitter and things. And another tool that the convention can use to bring countries together is more serial sites or more joint multinational tentative list sites. We have one tentative list site in Turkey, the Ayvalık Industrial Landscapes. It's basically just across the strait from Lesbos, Mytilene, where we have huge shared history there. I'm hoping maybe it can develop into a shared nomination in the future. And also the last point with Alessandro's point that Dathia also mentioned, does like the fact that OUV has to be fossilized or used as a singular narrative, how can we change that? Does this have to be that way? How can OUV definitions be more in tune with this fluidity and, like, let's say, relativity and of the real reality of how societies value and interpret heritage? So I think that's all from my notes. Thank you so much, and tolerance for your for the time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Adrian. Finally, let me have the pleasure of inviting His Excellency Yang, the Ambassador and Permanent Delegate of the People's Republic of China.
Hello to you all from Paris. Okay. First of all, I would really like to express my sincere thanks to the National Commission of the Republic of Korea for inviting me to participate in this online forum. I really have learned a lot from the excellent presentations by the previous speakers. So you are all experts. I'm here a poor diplomat. So it is a classroom for me. And of course, we have our World Heritage Center expert, Alexandra. So all the process for me, I come from the Chinese Ministry of Education, actually. For the culture sector, it is really a learning process for me to understanding. Even the word interpretation, before joining this session, I was thinking about interpretation, translation in letter and language term. Now I understand it is really how to interpret our heritage, our OUV of our science, of our historical facts. Okay. This is what I want to say. And the second, I would like to express my congratulations to the government of the Republic of Korea for making great efforts to closely work with UNESCO to promote heritage interpretation and to establish a UNESCO Category 2 institute in this regard. It is really important. If we want to do something, we need institutions, we need centers, we need experts, to work on this issue. It is really important. Number three, I just want to mention, heritage interpretation is very broad. It includes all the ways in which information is communicated to the public to a heritage site, such as a museum, a park, or a science center. More specifically, it is a communication of information about all the explanation of the nature, the origin, the purposes of historical, natural, or the cultural resources, objects, science, and phenomena use personal or non-personal method. So it's very broad. It is a huge area. And then I would like to say, from my humble experience, authenticity. It is a very simple principle to respect historical fact in a responsible manner. We have to respect historical facts in interpretation. That's really important. For peace, for development, for human rights, to adopt the peace, development, and human rights oriented or based approach in interpretation of heritage does not mean to whitewash or to twist or hide historical facts. I really like what Madame Dacia Visual Rose just mentioned. Okay, so we can't. we have to restore true historical facts. That is the true face of history. That is really important. And then the team of interpreters, the team of experts needs to be really inclusive and to reflect different viewpoints. And the interpretation per se is a process of a dialogue and understanding. So, as you know, of course, in UNESCO, we always said freedom of press, media freedom. So we always like to say it is a responsible and a free media. Why? Because everybody knows who controls the global media. So if we only say a free media, whose freedom is that? Do developing countries have the freedom to express themselves? Or who controls the media? So we have to discuss things in this way. So it's really, and we have to face a reality. So I really like to emphasize that the interpretation per se is a process of dialogue and understanding. We have to reflect different viewpoints, okay? And in this regard, I would like to say that UNESCO needs to do more to raise the capacity of experts in developing countries in interpreting history. So otherwise, okay, all the advisory bodies, the experts, majority that come from one group of countries do not reflect other cultures, and then it will become a difficulty in the World Heritage Committee meetings. So we have to engage to raise enhance the capacity of developing countries expert in interpret the history. And then I want to touch upon education has an important role to play. From basic education to higher education, from formal learning to non-formal and informal learning. So learning has indeed become ubiquitous. So as the Africans say, it takes a whole village to raise a child. So for interpreting history and heritage and education has a massive role to play. So I like the idea of cultural education, art education. So UNESCO, the education sector and the cultural sector have to work together to promote heritage education and interpretation. And finally, I would like to say new technologies. Of course, some experts just mentioned traditional technologies. So we can say all technologies have an important role to play in the interpretation heritage. So we have to put in good use of online tools, in particular during the pandemic. So to facilitate understanding of cultural heritage. Yeah, with this, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And okay, it's time to open our floor to general audiences. But before that, I'd like to give some chances to the speakers to make comment on the discussions that preceded just before, in the sequence by which presentations has been made. So may I invite Mr. Bersamo to make comment or add anything to your presentation?
Thank you very much. And very quickly, I want just to thank Bill, Peter, Richard, Dasha, AJ for their inspiring interventions. And I want also to thank very much Ambassador Young for his presence here today, his words, and especially also because he participated in UNESCO General Conference, which already just finished actually on a few days ago, and especially the Cultural Commission, in which this question that Dasha raised for me about synergies of between different conventions was somehow approached, and it's quite interesting. You know, I was almost dreaming when Dasha said that her students consider that certain sites could be also inscribed under different contexts than the World Heritage. This is very inspiring, and I look to a future, to a bright future, thinking about this. However, the reality is quite different because we see it every day. I must say, fortunately or unfortunately, because both are valid, but the success of the World Heritage Convention makes that everyone is just looking for World Heritage label. And as I said, this could be an advantage or a disadvantage, because the synergies about conventions are made quite difficult, I must say, both for technical issues and both for political issues. Technical issues is because in the end they deal with relatively different matters, topics, which also explains that these conventions have also quite different state parties, state members that signed this convention. So it's a bit more difficult to talk about these topics in the multilateral reality of UNESCO, where we are. And this also brings me to another note I wanted to make, actually, because the two examples, very beautiful examples of nominations that have worked really perfectly, I must say, almost perfectly in the sense of interpretation. The example of Ake of Canada, Buji being Australia. These are very good example of what the convention should do with inscription, and to have this inclusiveness which we were talking about, and the OUV that covers all the aspects and really is in line with the spirit of the convention and also the ideas that led to the constitution of UNESCO. However, the fact is that we have to acknowledge also the challenge and difficulties actually become more evident when dealing with cases that relates to more recent history facts and which involve more countries. These two cases that we cited, they are not so, they happened not so long ago, but they are not even so recent. And I was actually part of the expert meeting on sites of memory, which was organized in Paris in December 2019, where the question of the definition of recent in the context of the ongoing reflection on sites of memory was put forward. And in this context, recent is considered to be from the turn of the 20th century, even if, of course, in some cases, negative memories resulting from conflicts can endure for centuries, we know, and we see it every day also in our societies. However, I wanted really to stress this difference because we are in a very important turning point in the World Heritage Convention, as AJ was also mentioning about the notion of OUV, which is fixed. It is at the base of actually World Heritage inscription, and we see it also when working on the trying to work on a statement of outstanding universal value for sites that didn't have a statement when they were inscribed. So we are going back in time, trying to recreate the reason and justifications why sites were inscribed on the World Heritage List at the moment of inscription, which is a very difficult exercise because we have anyway an influence of what is happening today in our society, and a completely different view, for instance, of the idea of heritage as it was intended 40 years ago when certain sites were inscribed. So we have to really take into account all these difficulties when talking about interpretation, because of course, as we said from the beginning, I think here we are, we do all agree on this, that all cultural and natural sites have the potential to be sites of memory. But the real challenges now comes with the ones that really relates to different countries and that are more recent, because we see it very concretely. We have seen it also at the latest session of the committee, how certain debates can create a big divide. So we have to be careful and when talking about this whole topic, bearing in mind all these different aspects. This is all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Professor Logan, would you like to add something or make comments?
You're muted.
We can't hear you,
A rich set
Professor
of
Logan.
papers with many, many ideas, very hard to digest them all. I would like to see them written down and to think about them more deeply. My paper was really pointed to one issue only, and that was how interpretation should be used to avoid conflict between states parties and between communities within states. There are, of course, lots of other things that you might do with interpretation, and they've been canvassed very broadly in the various papers today. I think Dacia's point, which has been picked up by Edgar and others, that it's a great shame that we can't work in a more holistic manner. That we are confined to these conventions that have come along, facing the realpolitik that you could never throw out a convention because you might never get agreement to reinstate it or reinstate something more holistic. So really we're stuck with it, and we have to find these other ways that Edgar was talking about, where we can operate, where we can bring the memory of the world and the intangible and the World Heritage all together and deal with particular projects and so on. But the World Heritage system, apart from Criterion 6, is a bit sort of hamstrung, is a bit tied in. That is unfortunate, but I think we have to just work within those parameters. Thank you, Professor Sir. That's all I need to say, I think.
All right, thank you very much. And Professor Larsen?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I really also enjoyed the discussions that came out here, and it is difficult to summarize, but I'd like to say at least bring two issues, or two dimensions, one on challenges and one on opportunities. On challenges, I really hear people stressing, of course, that we know today. We know about the fragmented ways in which we easily work. We know about the narrow ways of dealing with interpretation. We've seen also, as Alessandro just said, the divides coming up, but also as Richard insisted upon, there are deep running legacy issues in that long list we have of existing World Heritage sites where interpretation remains a major challenge. And indeed, something we need to figure out ways of dealing with that legacy context. At the same time, I think, the meeting really, for me, underlined those great sets of opportunities that are there. And I feel that perhaps what we need to really start with is moving towards a new World Heritage narrative, bringing up Dacia's points about this room for dissonance, where indeed we value that, and where the World Heritage space becomes an arena where these things can actually be addressed. Now, of course, you might say that's very nice and all that, but reality is that existing committee meetings have shown the difficulty that the diplomatic circles sometimes have in approaching difference and dissonance. At the same time, I couldn't help also being impressed by Ambassador Yang's emphasis on this diplomatic culture of education and capacity building and dialogue and so on. And I'm wondering if it's not time indeed to mobilize that diplomatic community we have in the World Heritage Committee today compared to 20 years ago, in trying to build a new space where we speak more to issues of difference and dissonance, and indeed move towards what this meeting also has stressed, having clear principles for how equitable and inclusive interpretation can take place. So in that sense, I see that we have all the ingredients and substance here for strong decision making around this. We have the justification, we have the challenges and issues that clearly justify policy and diplomatic intention. And I think we also have the opportunities there in terms of actions and way forward. So I'd just like to, again, thank you for the opportunity to this. And I really hope that this meeting can be sort of a what's it called, a springboard, a starting point, a jumping board to take this forward with the committee as well in its following conversations. But thanks again to all the discussions, extremely rich. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Kim?
Thank you for the presenter. You give us a very informative the comment and idea. I'd like to mention three things. First, from the Professor Dacia. Dacia said mention about the archive, but actually we don't have any the detail how to the establish the archive at the moment, because this year we have we collected some kind of idea about what kind of direction the WHIPIC should go. In this point, we realized that the interpretation is a kind of a record of the process, continuous process. So we at the time we need some information and share the information, and then the people should decide with the kind of information. This is our our conclusion from the consulting. So now we know what we have to do, but how to do it is it will be we will continue to elaborate the next year, because we will start from the officially we will establish early of the next year. So at the time we will start right away, more elaborate our direction into the project and program. And then second thing is that for the the heritage in conflicts. I mean the conflict usually the people don't want to conflict and tension, because it makes the negative emotion. But also, in heritage interpretation, tension between the country or the stakeholder in one country, there is some tension about the heritage interpretation. But I think it depends on the mind, how to look at the conflict and tension. But we think conflict and tension can be seen in more positive way. For example, conflict can be a kind of source of development. It depends on how to manage and deal with the kind of tension. So in this case of the heritage in conflict, also same case, I think. But we need more discussion on the issue how to manage that kind of conflict. But it's very easy way is just avoid the conflict and tension. But this. I'm not quite sure this is the right way, but WHIPIC also, this is a very delicate issue. So sometime in the case in our internal discussion, we should focus on this issue or not. So we have discussed with our members, but finally we decide we also deal with this kind of issue in active manner. But first, we don't provide any kind of solution, but we need we would like to provide some kind of discussion platform to talk about this kind of issue at international or national level. That maybe many people think about this kind of issue can conclude a kind of consensus on the issue. And then third issue is that you from the WHIPIC, I mean, it's a kind of locality in heritage interpretation. I'm not quite sure what I understand correctly, but from our the mid and long term plan, we have not think about much about this issue. Because I mean, in the World Heritage System, there's a lot of stakeholders we have to relate to. But first, we think about the member state, and then the international expert will be our main partner to discuss about some of the issue. But many presenters said the cultural diversity in heritage interpretation is very important. I think the diversity comes from the locality. So we are much more concerned, or we would like to reflect locality issue in heritage interpretation into our the future detailed project and program too. So I think this is my comment, and then also to take this opportunity, I would like to thank for the Dacia and Ege, and then Peter for our consulting in the people. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Now I'm finding that the questions from the general audience are piling up. However, we had requests from discussants for their comment, for the chance of comments. So let me have Professor McKay. Just please
thank you,
be
Professor.
brief.
So, thank you. I will just make a very quick further intervention, if I may. Reflecting on these further contributions, it does rather occur to me that we not only have the question of multiple rights holders or stakeholders involved in the properties themselves and multiple narratives that go with those properties, we also, of course, have multiple audiences. And in terms of interpreting a property or a World Heritage Site, the manner and the message when it is interpreted to a government, the government of the same state party or a different state party with a different perception, or to different classes of visitors. What springs to mind for religious and spiritual properties, the interpretation for pilgrims may be very different, or may be the same for interpretation for tourists. And it seems to me that this hinges very much on our whole notion and construct of authenticity, because really, and reflecting on the intervention and contribution from His Excellency Ambassador Yang, there is, of course, a strong desire to interpret historical facts, but in reality, for many places, they're not historical facts, they're historical perceptions. And again, they are selections of the messages. So I think there is a very interesting issue to be resolved in this space about interpreting difficult properties and difficult messages where there is dissonance, not only in relation to the place itself, but also in the different groups of people who might relate to that place.
Thank you. Any other comments from either speakers or discussants? Okay, if so, then yes, please.
Thank you so much. Very quickly, I just wanted to reinforce the message of positivity and hope that some of our colleagues here made. There are opportunities and tools at hand, even in the convention. We are trying to introduce a more interpretation-oriented new tool, but the old tools that we have, some of them are much more collaboration-inducing. Maybe we need to just reinforce their application in more often and provide encouragement and incentive carrots for using ways to just enhance ways of communicating. And I think facing difficult, negative, conflicting issues head on may not always really work, and you have to go around, circumvent these by introducing something that everybody feels good about, and then that enables a softer environment where you are ready afterwards to, face the more difficult tasks. So I think there are a lot of collaborative tools in the convention that can be channeled into that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now I'd like to open the floor to the general audience, and we have the first question from Egypt. I'm not sure whether his name is Mr. or Miss, but Asma Muneam, please turn on your camera.
Hello, everyone. I thank you for this fruitful online forum. I am Asma from Egypt. I am a curator in the Egyptian Museum, and I have a master degree on health conservation and site management, and hope to be a member in WHIPIC. And my question is how to be a member in your center.
We don't have any membership, but we want the partner. If you have any idea and thought to cooperate with us in heritage interpretation, please do not hesitate to contact us. We can share the idea and then exchange, more the elaborated idea, and then finally we can cooperate and then act together. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And next question is from Siwon Lee. Are you there? Please turn on your camera and.
Hello. I'm Siwon Lee, heritage researcher from South Korea. Thank you all for all the efforts for this conference, and all the presentations were impressive. I have one question to visa rules, the ASEA visa rules. I will agree with the idea, the need for archiving the changing process or stratum of heritage interpretation, as she mentioned. Therefore, it seems that an appropriate framework or initiative should be established. However, what should we keep in mind when making such standards or plans for archiving them?
Okay, Professor Bielrose, could you make?
Yes, happy. Thank you for the question. I'm not sure. I was inspired by Mr. Kim's mention of this archive, which I hadn't thought of before, and by my own students' observations that things are changing and that interpretation panels are changing, and the labels in museums are currently changing. And that I think that as they change, it would be important to document the process of change so that we know what we're changing things from. And it would be interesting, imagine if we could have all the museum labels from, let's say, the British Museum for the past 50 years and how they've changed. When do they change? How do they change? So it's a question of now that things are changing, make sure we document that change rather than just throw the old labels or throw the old panels into the garbage bin, to at least document them. So we have a record of what they were, so that then we can document the changes, because they will change again. And I think it would be really interesting for a center dedicated to World Heritage interpretation to begin to archive the changes in interpretation as they're taking place.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answers your question.
All right. Mr. Lee, do you have any further question?
No, thank you.
Thanks. We have a question pertaining to a very sensitive issue between Japan and Korea from a reporter of Japanese newspaper, probably stationed in Korea. Mr. or Miss Mina, I can read it.
Yeah, here I am.
Okay, please show yourself and pose your question. But before you start, you are asking me to reveal my opinion, but the moderator is not in the position to express my opinion. So if you ask any question to the speakers or discussants, then your question may be or may not be answered, but I'm not in the position to answer directly to your question. I hope I made it clear. Yes, please.
Yes, anyways, thank you very much. So, can you hear me?
Sure.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the rich discussion about the interpretation on the World Heritage. But I would like to ask you more concrete case, as you mentioned that the president now said that there's always a division in the interpretation of the World Heritage currently on the sides of the major industrial side. So Japan and South Korea is always struggling to find the reconciliation, but it is always problematic. So if the president cannot answer, so I would like to pose to the question to the Mr. Kim or any other participants in this discussion. So how it is possible to overcome the gap between the two countries, especially Japan and South Korea, on the interpretation of World Heritage, concretely the major industrial revolution?
Okay, that's your question. I understand. Would there be any speaker who would like to partial advice as to how to reconcile the divided opinions on the interpretation of that particular heritage? Professor Logan, would you be available for this issue?
Well, I have written about this. The article that I mentioned before deals with the number of conflicts between Korea and Japan and China, not just in World Heritage, but also in the memory of the world. And really that is partly the inspiration for trying to develop a new approach to interpretation that would mean that in future, places that where states parties have irreconcilable views would simply not be put forward. They would either have to come to some kind of negotiated agreement, or the place would not be put forward. Okay, now that sounds a bit draconian, but you know, the World Heritage System is a UNESCO program that is about building bridges to peace. And the places that can't do that, that don't fit with that. Need to be protected in other ways. You know, there are all sorts of ways you can protect places with your national legislation, your national heritage system. They don't have to always go through World Heritage. You know, the World Heritage label shouldn't give any better protection than your national system. But, you know, a place where there are irreconcilable conflicts should, in my opinion at least, should not have the UNESCO stamp on them. They shouldn't have the UNESCO status.
Okay, thank you very much. And now Dr. Han, the Secretary General of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, would like to have a chance to speak. Professor?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Before I took the office of the Secretary General, I taught at Seoul National University, and I'm a cultural anthropologist. As a cultural anthropologist, I thank Professor Logan for suggesting the 5 principles for interpretation. I completely agree with these 5 principles, but I'm very much worried about the explanation or presentation of the first principle, the peace, because on superficial reading, principle 1 seems to be incompatible with principle 4 or principle 3, because in principle 4 you say that the heritage interpretation shall reflect multiple voices about the significance of the cultural heritage place. And principle 3 says that heritage interpretation shall respect cultural diversity. But for your interpretation of the peace principle is that, well, I like that there are 2 sentences under the heading principle 1. The first sentence reads, the principle means that heritage interpretation must help to promote a culture of peace. I completely agree with this first sentence. But the next sentence reads, it must not create, exacerbate, or prolong tensions between state parties, nor should it threaten peace and security between or within state parties. I think the second sentence is a very narrow or negative definition of peace, because UNESCO was founded to build up defense of peace in the minds of men. It's not to avoid any chance of conflict or tension. So if you define peace as a state of absence of conflict or tension, a state of friendship or harmony, then, this multiple voices or diversity might seem to threaten peace. But if we think of peace as a sort of a dynamic process, which does not involve repression or exploitation, not just the absence of armed conflict or tension, then I think the principle 1, the peace principle, should be in different wordings, because it's not just the absence of tension or conflict. The understanding or peace means the kind of dialogue between the parties for a non-violent resolution of differences. So there may be differences of opinions, but it does not mean that it should not be expressed. I think World Heritage or the other UNESCO inscription process can provide a very good chance for such a dialogue, the chance to understand each other better, and perhaps we can abolish ignorance, defeat ignorance and misunderstanding and prejudice. So I think we should be far more active. We need an active engagement of ideas. So that's why I'm asking you a question, whether you are willing to change your wording of Principle 1 from the negative sense of peace to a more positive or active definition of peace. Thank you.
Professor Logan, please.
Thank you, Dr. Han. That's exactly the sort of comment that we're looking for. As you know, we have a group, Dacia and Peter, we're working on these principles, so we really value your comment. I suppose as a personal reflection, without having discussed this with the rest of the team, yes, of course it's dynamic, and what we're trying to say, I think, is that where there is conflicting interpretations, we would like to see that negotiation between the states parties takes place before the nomination comes forward. It's really asking too much of the UNESCO system, the World Heritage System, to solve problems once they're on the list. And you probably know as well as I do that there is one particular example where negotiation has been tried but is not successful. So to avoid that, really, we're saying places like that should not come onto the World Heritage List. You shouldn't be asking UNESCO to solve these international negotiation problems. That needs to be done by the states parties before the nomination is put in. That's why I keep stressing interpretation is at the start. It's the very start of the nomination process. It doesn't come in after the nomination, after the inscription has occurred. But thank you very much for your comment. That's very useful.
Thank you. Any other comments? Do we have any?
Three of us, actually.
Dr. Ildrim, would you comment?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Su. I agree with Professor Bill Logan as well. And I think maybe what's something we might do as the team is add an emphasis on how supporting peace does not mean looking the other way and pretending that tensions don't exist. We have more expert colleagues here. I'm sure Datia can say better things about this, but negotiating, as Bill said, or trying to resolve them without escalating them is probably the way that we need to go and what we try to mean. And there might need to be some explanation or clarification in our wording that not exacerbating does not mean running away from problems. So it's an interesting nuance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Professor Larsen?
Thank you. No, I just want to sort of support this idea of really having a dynamic approach towards understanding peace and conflict and so on. I think it's very useful. I think it's also very useful to indeed think, as has been insisted upon by previously, upon the nomination process, but we also have to acknowledge that we don't necessarily see all issues immediately in nomination processes, and it's very difficult sometimes to also understand what might come out of it. So I do think that we need to think constructively about how to actually have a common basis for the World Heritage Convention to really deal with these legacy issues, or when things come up later on, and how to address that more constructively. And that's something I think that the committee really could, distinguish itself and making their mark in history by bringing to the table. So I think, the number of sites that are on the list already is impressive, is massive, and I do think that we need to think constructively about addressing existing things as situations as well, not just the new nominations. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Biehoros?
Yes, thank you. I'll be brief. I just wanted to thank Professor Han for his contribution. As Professor Logan said, that's really useful. And I just wanted, originally in my contribution, I had held back from bringing in the academics terms, but there's a few that I think might be useful. And there's one in particular that I find very helpful, where a political scientist, Chantal Mouffe, has talked about agonistic and agonism and not shying away from this. And this is where I find inspiration in saying things like, we should embrace the dissonance in heritage, where rather than pretend that the agonism, right, is not, and this is not antagonism. It's not that that the differences have to be in active conflict and fighting each other. It's just that there are differences, and acknowledging that. And I find that with World Heritage, one of the traps that we often fall into is equating outstanding universal value with a universal story. They're not the same. So you can have outstanding universal value without reducing stories to a kind of neutral, objective, universal, and rather simplified narrative. I think we have to go away with equating those two things. And I think we can have universal value of complicated histories that are universal because of their diversity, and that sense of kind of working through the dialogue and not privileging one interpretation over another, but working on agonism that is as the kind of the bringing together of conflicting interpretations rather than trying to find a neutral, objective meeting point, because that's where what I call the Disney effect comes in, right? So Disney takes all these very complex narratives, myths of various different countries, makes a mishmash of several of them, and then represents them as a kind of unifying story. But that does a violence to the complexities of these actual multiple stories. So I think, and that brings in two concepts that I just wanted to introduce aside from this one, which one of them is one my colleague Andreas Pantazatos works on. He's a philosopher here in the department, working on epistemic justice and heritage, which is about everybody involved in the process really knowing and owning the heritage intellectually and emotionally. And for that, what Ambassador Yang was saying is so fundamental, that education and heritage have to go hand in hand at all levels. And the second one is the sense of, in the Sarre-Savoy report, if you remember in France, the Sarre-Savoy report on the return of objects taken from throughout the African continent that found their ways into French collections through colonialism. One of the things that the Sarre-Savoy report calls on is a new relational ethics. And I think that's really important. If we can bring that new relational ethics between the different parties into these conversations on these complicated stories, and have in mind an idea of epistemic justice where everyone's knowledge and everyone's experience counts, I think that would be a way of working through this dissonance and making that part of the richness of the process and of the sites rather than a problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me. Any other comment? I find no question from the general audience now, and I think this time to wrap up. But finally, may I invite Ambassador Yang for your final comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I found that our discussion is really rich. It's great to see the professors in this forum. Usually when diplomats sit in the committee, everything is represented their country. They have different political views, understanding. Here, and sometimes we can get very excited. And here we sit very tightly and listen to your views. It is really aspirational. It's really good. So I would thank our host of the Republic of Korea, and I hope the Category 2 Center will play an active role in this area. And I hope that we'll have more opportunities to have very thorough discussions on the issue. It is really important. So we are responsible for our future generations to let them to have an authentic understanding of heritage. This is the base of peace. If we cannot face the historical reality, we cannot interpret it in a very authentic way, it will create a problem for the future. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, this comes our session to a close, and my particular appreciation to two Australian participants who had to stay until midnight. I hope very, very comfortable night's sleep tonight for both of you, and also happiness and health for every participant of this session. Thank you very much, and this session is closed. Thank you.